All right, guys. Well, welcome to week 3 and chapter 3 as we get into understanding crime and victimization. I hope so far the course has gone well for you. I know the reading may feel like it's a little bit, but again, as I've mentioned before, this course is very heavily driven by the textbook as we're moving through. So I hope you're finding the discussions going okay. Um, I hope you're remembering to jump in on Mondays and log your attendance. And as always, if you have any questions throughout the course, feel free to shoot me an email or send me a text message. But for now, let's jump into chapter 3. So today, we're going to talk about at a high level uh, conversations related to crime being a rational decision. We're going to talk about the biology um, of criminals. We're going to talk about psychological factors that impact criminality. We're going to talk about personality traits and crime, social structure and crime, social processes that impact crime. We're also going to discuss critical criminology. We're going to talk about some developmental theories, and we're going to talk about theories of victimization. Essentially, we're looking at factors that influence or cause crime, and then we're looking at factors that increase the likelihood of victimization. There are a couple of things that personally you may struggle with within this particular topic, especially when we begin to argue about, or not argue, but discuss factors that influence criminal behavior. If you're like me and understand life through the context and lens of faith, you fully recognize that the decision to commit a crime is a choice. Um, that makes some of the theories that we're going to talk about a little difficult to swallow. But what I'm going to ask you to do is have an open mind, consider the theories on their face without completely rejecting them just because of what it is the Bible tells us. And take a look at some of the factors that may influence or make the decision to commit a crime perhaps a little easier than what we might have seen before. Anyhow, let's dive in. So, our very first point crime is a rational decision. Recognizing that crime is a choice requires us to understand that there are some key points or key actions that happen when someone chooses to commit a crime. It requires them to weigh the action they desire to take against the possible consequences that exist. This is where the theory of deterrence comes in, that if we punish someone uh, hard enough or drastically enough, it would deter anyone else from taking the same action. It requires a criminal to consider elaborate planning and execution in order to avoid detection. These are things that we can see within organized crimes, particularly with the cartels. It also requires continuity planning to prepare for the eventual detection or capture of criminal activity. We see this with cartels on a regular basis. More specifically, we can see and have encountered mules who are bringing illicit substances into the United States and are captured. More than likely, there is a load or a larger load right behind them to ensure that what they were hired to deliver actually gets there. They go with more than what is necessary, more vehicles than what is necessary. Law enforcement may pick one off and two still get through. It's a pretty good continuity plan when you actually look at the planning steps that they've taken to work through that. It also requires someone to analyze opportunities to commit crime. So they have to view the landscape, consider what it is they're wanting to accomplish, and consider where that can occur. We counter all of this through deterrence and by limiting opportunities for people to act. When we talk about biology and criminality, there are a couple of different theories that come to play that have really carried greater long term weight than others have. The first one is traits. Lombroso worked early on to consider physical traits in people that may or may not have led to what he determined to be primal activities or a primal mindset, meaning someone who was underdeveloped or didn't see the world the way that it was and acted out violently, contrary to the standards of the current culture at that time. He literally measured skulls, noses, height, shoulder width, etc., to look at the argument that basically criminals were more Neanderthals than regular people were. Neurological factors include theories related to how chemicals impact our brains in a manner that may cause us to act in a criminal manner. Specifically, this looks at substance abuse. Addiction drives a lot of crime. We know this. We can measure and see that. But there are other factors, such as people who suffer with ADHD and don't have the uh, ability to focus or to fully consider actions and consequences before they take a step, and hormones. Hormonal imbalances have been known to cause people to act out on a regular basis as well. Some other theories that have been brought up relate to genetics, and studies have shown that antisocial behavior is believed to be an inherited trait. Now, remember, and I'll bring this up again here in a little bit, antisocial behavior is not the same thing as saying someone is introverted. Antisocial behavior is acts, activities, or actions that are contrary to societal norms. Genetic abnormalities can be linked to a variety of behaviors, and because they can, it's presumed that some of those behaviors are criminal in nature. When we're talking about psychology and criminality, there are a couple of different disorders that have been studied. Particularly, oppositional defiant disorder is an ongoing pattern of uncooperative, defiant, and hostile behavior. Typically, these are people who reject authority, who will work against authority simply because authority exists, or look to simply break a rule because the rule was put in place. Conduct disorder sees people having difficulty following rules, much like defiant disorders, but we see this largely with adolescents, and they typically will act out in a delinquent manner. Clinical depression shows folks with the inability to concentrate, as well as a ton of other symptoms. We've all probably been exposed to or been around someone who suffers from depression, and we can see several different traits with them. In youths, particularly juveniles, depressed youth will display delinquent actions as well. It's important to point out that when we start to look at criminal theories or theories related to the causes of criminal actions, in many cases, these studies are focused on juveniles. And the reason for that is because if we can intervene early and cause criminal activity to desist in a juvenile, they're more likely to have a successful adulthood instead of becoming career criminals. That's always been the goal, is to cease criminal activity into adulthood. Alexith, I can't pronounce that, but it's alexithmia, is an emotional cognition disorder. In other words, a severe lack of empathy exists in someone. So we don't recognize the fact that we may have hurt someone's feelings or damaged someone else emotionally through our own actions. So we simply know what we desire and work to obtain that. Let's talk next about personality traits. Some psychologists have viewed criminal behavior as a byproduct of a disturbed personality structure. Specifically, we're talking about psychopaths and sociopaths, and those describe antisocial personalities. And as I've already mentioned before, saying that someone is antisocial is not saying that they're introverted or that they withdraw from crowds or don't like being around other people. It specifically applies to a failure to conform to societal norms, being deceitful, acting impulsively, irritability without cause, and a lack of remorse are those factors that we see in antisocial behavior. When we talk about social structure, and we did a little bit of that in the previous chapter as well, but this theory considers poverty and high crime rates. It looks at racial disparities and high crime rates, and specifically, it looks at disorganized neighborhoods that create an environment that is more opportune for crime than others. That tracks next into our social processes. We typically like to argue and measure that crime occurs in more disparate neighborhoods that are economically challenged, that where poverty is high, where social structures lack, and substance abuse issues are predominant. But we also know that crime exists throughout our social structure. So crime exists within high class societies, within middle class societies, within lower class societies. Um, Based on social process thoughts, then crime is influenced more um, by experiences and socialized behavior or normalized behavior. So here we're talking about dysfunctional family problems. We're talking about our education level or problems within our education systems being influenced by our peers, and of course, social learning that is impacted by our entire environment. When we see behavior, even if it's criminal behavior, but understand it or recognize it as normal, we're more likely to act out and embody uh, those same behaviors as we've seen in other people. Critical criminology holds that the economic and political forces operating in society are the fundamental causes of crime. Here we're talking about state organized crime, acts committed by people in power, officials, whether they're elected or bureaucratic, holding on to what they have control of and acting out in order to ensure that they can. Um, this theory has gained some greater support in recent years, mostly due to an examination of factors that force criminal activity, but at the same time, it's also more about preservation than it is about acting out. Developmental theory, straight from our text, okay, is a view of crime holding that as people travel through the life course, their experiences on the way influence their behavior patterns. Behavior changes at each stage of the human experience. Let's break that down and make it more practical. From toddlers to children to adolescence to adulthood to later stages of adulthood, we change over time. What is important to us when we were younger is not as important to us when we were older, and that impacts our behavior on a daily basis. This is why studies show that most criminals typically age out of crime because priorities have changed as they have gotten older. In some instances, with career criminals, the type of criminal activity changes as they get older, and so they may still persist in crime, but the type of crime that's committed typically changes over time. Let's talk briefly about victims. There are several different theories related to victimization or why people end up as victims of crime. One theory is precipitation, in that victims are often involved in their own demise, whether they recognize it or not, through provocative action, through impulsive activity, or through personal conflict. Lifestyle has a big contribution to the concept of who becomes a victim. Our particular lifestyles can increase or decrease the exposure to criminal activity, and criminals themselves are often victims of crime. If you went into any law enforcement station and were given permission to peruse their investigative case files, you would probably find an individual who's been a suspect, who's been arrested or charged with a crime, and who has also been the victim of a crime. Within probably a 24-month period, they've been both. The routine activities theory shows us that our everyday patterns, our everyday behaviors, the things that we normally do, can sometimes make us an opportune victim if we're easily tracked. Meaning, if we don't change our patterns on a regular basis, we can be impacted by predators who have observed that typical behavior on a regular basis. Guys, this is shorter than last week's lecture. I don't intend to dive crazy hard into all of these different theories, except to say this. We establish theories in order to test data based on how we're reacting, with the goal of mitigating crime and mitigating criminal activity. In other words, to work at protecting our society, we have to understand what causes people to act in the manner in which they do. We can't solely rely on the fact that people make their own decisions. I'm someone who firmly believes that people choose to commit a crime or not. but I do recognize and understand that there are factors that influence those decisions that we don't always have a good understanding of. And the more we can dig into that, the better we are at creating systems that help mitigate the desire to act in a criminal manner. I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in your discussion post this week, and we'll move on to chapter 4 after this week is done. Thanks for your time.